listening outside the classroom, recreational listening, listening just to enjoy what they hear. And these are the environmental factors. Then there are also some of the more, how I would say, common factors that especially teachers would take note of. Task difficulties, ease of task, such as question types. Sometimes it is the activities, whether it is inside or outside the classroom, and also repetition. Is there enough repetition in a task for our students to be able to hear better? Now, speaker characteristics is also another very important part of this. I'll be talking about some of these in greater detail later. And of course, then there's the text factors. Now, these are called, I would call them internal or external factors. And these factors actually influence the way we, as well as our learners, process the information that we hear, whether cognitively, socially, or strategically. So let me now go into some of the research that has been conducted over the years. A piece of research I want to cite here is Joan Robin's 1994, a very extensive review of the research of second language listening at that time. Now, Rubin surveyed about 100 studies, and that was probably the extent to which the publications were during that time. And she grouped these different studies according to factors that influence listening. So text factor, task factor, interlocutor, which refers to the people we speak with, and the listener, which is really the person or the internal difference or capabilities of the listener, and the process. And at that time in particular, there was a lot of emphasis on top-down and bottom-up processing. And listening strategies was just being researched. So these are the 5 factors that Rubin talked about. And these are what Patricia Dunkel wrote about in another way in 1991, what she refers to as the inside and outside the head factors. So just now I showed you the internal and external factors. They are pretty similar. Now, another set of review was done by Vandergrift in 2007. And as you can see, there are some changes here. We still look at research, a lot of research increasingly coming out on the dimensions of listening, the cognitive, social, and affective side. And increasingly, there was also interrogation into the way we teach and we assess listening. So Vandergrift also highlighted the teaching and assessment approaches that have been examined by researchers. And at that time also, and we look back, that it was also when technology, especially digitalization, started to become very important in our life, and particularly in the way we as teachers try to incorporate technology into the teaching of listening. So Vandergrift identified these are different areas in which research has been carried out. And what I intend to do today is to build on the research and the factors that have been identified and talk about particularly some of the more recent research and where we are and where we need to go from here. And very importantly is also, as language educators, what can we get out of some of these research insights? So what does research tell us about internal factors, external factors, as well as the teaching of listening? And for internal factors, I will be focusing on working memory, knowledge sources, prior and linguistic knowledge, metacognition, as well as anxiety. So let me start with this, and then I will move on to the others. Now, I just also want to highlight to all the participants here that because of time constraint, I have put actually quite a fair bit of information in text form on my slides. So do feel free to capture the information so that you can follow up on your own, because I won't be able to go into all of them in detail. I'm happy for you to refer to this piece of work cited if you find it helpful. So what are the internal factors? Let me start with working memory. Now we know that cognitive processing is very important is a very important consideration for our understanding of second language listening. During Rubin's time, she looked at a lot of studies that looked at top-down as well as bottom-up processing. But in recent years, we find that many researchers have become very interested in looking at the role of working memory. So this is a very specific aspect of cognitive processing. So what is working memory? According to Jeffs and Harrington, they are temporary storage and manipulation of information, right? And this actually helps us very much, whether we are as, learners or whether we're just communicating, how much we can store, how much we can manipulate this information as we listen. And there are different kinds of tests that have been used, but one of the things that I would say is a trend is that many of our researchers make use of methods from cognitive psychology in order to test working memory capacity as well as processing capability while working with information. Now, working memory is often examined together with other variables, although initially I think some of the studies only examined working memory on its own. But what we have found is that working memory has a relationship, but it's quite inconclusive how strong that relationship is, even though we know it is useful and it is important. So different studies show different kinds of the strength of relationship. So Adringer et al., for example, looked at used a battery of tests and found the relationship to be strong only in certain areas. And what is more interesting, I think, for us is to see that when working memory is researched alongside other variables, such as metacognition, such as vocabulary knowledge, working memory has a relationship, but it's not strong. So researchers such as Matthew Wallace, such as Vandergrift and Baker, they have looked at how working memory figures in this relationship when we examine different factors together. And what is interesting and perhaps not surprising to many of us is that when different factors are examined together, vocabulary came out to be the strongest predictor and has the strongest influence on listening comprehension. Now, another set of internal factors are prior and linguistic knowledge. So I mentioned top-down processing just now, and that definitely it is still a very important part of processing using our background knowledge. But researchers also found that prior knowledge may not always be useful and may not always be there. So I think, for example, Banerjee and Papagiorgio give us a more nuanced understanding of prior knowledge. So in their study, they examined the responses of students, of test takers to questions about occupation, questions in the occupation domain. And I think the hypothesis was that the older respondents who have working experience will be able to answer some of those questions better because they have that background knowledge about work and occupation. But surprisingly, the younger respondents were also able to do quite well in some of the items related to work. So this also gives us food for thought about the way prior knowledge is used or how prior knowledge can be acquired through other means. And very often also it is seen to interact with other knowledge such as linguistic knowledge in order to achieve the kind of interpretation that we need. Now, linguistic knowledge is definitely very important. We know language is the building block of any kind of communication. So if the students cannot process the phonological features, hear some of the words, the forms, if they don't have sufficient grammar and vocabulary, we would think that it is going to affect listening comprehension. But also the interesting thing is linguistic knowledge also interacts with prior knowledge. So I think what I'm trying to say so far, if you catch my drift too, is that these factors do not operate on its own. They tend to operate interactively And the strength of these relationships are shown in many of the studies that have been published recently. Grammar and vocabulary, interestingly, when these two types of knowledge are seen together as linguistic knowledge, they have a strong correlation with listening comprehension. But some studies have shown that if you remove grammar and vocabulary and you separate the two, it is really vocabulary knowledge that has a greater relationship. And in some cases, the grammar knowledge also does not have a significant relationship. Now, another interesting thing about knowledge is that some learners actually overcome a weaker linguistic base with strategy use. So, for example, in Steyer's study with German learners of English, he found that Steyer found that even students who didn't score so well in vocabulary were able to do reasonably well, not very well, reasonably well. And part of the reason could be they were using other resources to help them understand what they hear. And so Van Zeelen, for example, Graham, Santos, and Van der Planck also refer to the possibility that the students were using other resources in order to strategically process the information. Now, another set of internal factors, metacognition. And for this, I would use the separation of metacognitive knowledge and strategies following Flavel. And metacognition contributes to learner variance. It does show that it plays a part in differentiating learners' performance in second language listening comprehension. But at the same time, researchers are also telling us that just strategies alone is not going to help. Very often it is the orchestration of top-down and bottom-up strategies. That means using your prior knowledge as well as drawing on knowledge about the language, including hearing some of the things and using the sounds to help build understanding. One thing that is, I think, agreed upon by many researchers who look into strategy use is that metacognitive strategies are very useful, but very often we find that the less skilled listeners may not be using them so effectively, partly because a lot of their processing capacity is spent on maybe manipulating the information through cognitively rather than stepping back and planning or monitoring and evaluating. Now, another set of internal factors are anxiety. Anxiety has been researched for quite a while. So, for example, Arnold, maybe 20 years ago, had looked into listening anxiety. And I'm happy to see that some of the papers in this conference also look into anxiety. These are situation specific, and the findings probably do not surprise us because there's a strong negative relationship between listening anxiety and learners with lower listening or with listening ability. So, and this is found in different languages such as English, French, Arabic. Now, I think what is interesting too that's coming out of these studies is that anxiety may be mediated by developing metacognitive awareness about how listening takes place and also about the ability to learn to use strategies. So these are reported by Su 2015, Su 2017, who looked at how anxiety can be mediated. Vafi and Suzuki has something very interesting to offer as well. When they were analyzing their findings or their data, they found that if you control anxiety, if you take anxiety out of the whole equation, then working memory capacity has a strong relationship, has a fairly strong relationship with listening comprehension. So what that suggests also is that the researchers say is that anxiety may have a debilitating effect on executive functioning. And that is why learners aren't able to process information as quickly and as effectively as they can. So let me now go into external factors, and I only have 2 slides for this. Speakers. Now, speaker characteristics have been researched for quite some time now, but they tend to focus on two things: accent, whichever way we define it to be, and speech rate, how quickly someone speaks, or how learners perceive the rate of the speech is. The truth is that sometimes the speed may not be that fast, but it is because learners are grappling with processing information in real time that what seems to be what is a normal speed appears to be pretty fast for the learners. Interestingly, one of the studies that came out, Abby Wickrama, tested the students' performance in the listening test, and the speakers for the different inputs are actually L2 speakers with different L2 speaker accent. And she found no difference in the way they performed according to, the different speaker accents, which means that there is already, the learners are able to process and not affected in one way or another by these differences. Interestingly, Oki and colleagues show that dialectal accents may have an influence. So it's the same language, whether it's American English, but different dialects. They looked at strengths of dialects and how that affects the difficulty of some items for the students. Now, Harding, in one of his studies, talked about accent familiarity. So is there an advantage? Now, in Harding's study, he found that there was an advantage. The students who shared the same L1 of Mandarin and Japanese did better than those who didn't share this L1 advantage. Now, as you can see, there aren't that really many studies that are coming out of this, especially in recent years, about this more nuanced understanding of accent. So definitely there's room to understand more. Another set of external factors are task and text. Now, I put these two together because one of the reasons is that text and task are, in a sense, interdependent in some ways. So, for example, Reves and Brownford identified some text characteristics that also contributed to task difficulty. So, lexical density, lexical diversity, difficult vocabulary, academic items, content of causality, and so on, can contribute to task difficulty. Now, in terms of task characteristics, there are some which are pretty straightforward, and I've listed them here for you. Slowing down the speed of input, length, the frequency of input. And for this, let me just also elaborate that researchers such as Broom et al. And found that actually, it doesn't mean that the more times a person listens, the comprehension will be better, because it also depends on the length of the input. And in some cases, Field also talked about, in students, when students or test takers can listen to an input twice, it does not necessarily mean that the second listening is going to help them, because some students will spend the second listening looking and reading the questions. And this takes me to the last point, which is reading test items while listening. This is part and parcel of the task. And IADUS 2019 used eye tracking devices to look at how much time students fix their attention on reading. And one of the conclusions that came out is that, reading while listening does change the nature of the listening task. And this will have implications, particularly for assessment. Now, corpus study is not particularly related to L2 listening, but I think there are many things that we can learn from the linguistic analysis, the report that has come out concerning importance markers, lexical bundles, including formulaic language and so on, which we as teachers can draw on to help develop teaching and learning. Now, let me come to the last part, which is the approaches to teaching and listening. This slide merely just shows you how the teaching of listening has progressed and changed over the years. Half a century ago, it was a lot of testing approach. You listen and you answer the question. It's a comprehension-oriented approach. Then in the 70s and early 80s, where the communicative language teaching methodology became so strong, listening came into its own. listening began to be taught and practiced because it is seen as a very important communication skill. And in the 80s and all the way till now, we see that learner-orientedness is the way that most educators and researchers would would focus on when it comes to researching teaching. Now, the reason is that there are so many things that we can do to help learners develop their agency, whether it is through practice, whether it is through focusing on the way they learn, the way they process. All these is going to help are going to help our learners. So I showed the 3 arrows here because there is no firm stop of this orientedness, because we still find features of text comprehension activities in some of our listening classes. But what we see and we hope to see more of is the communication-oriented plus the learner-oriented approach to teaching, speaking, listening. So let's take a quick look at the teaching approaches, methods that have been investigated by researchers. Bottom-up skills training, a very important part of helping our learners listen better. Now, one of the reasons is that it's been reported that inefficient perception of bottom-up processing is one of the biggest problems, particularly of our less skilled listeners. Decoding, lexical segmentation, and so on. Word recognition. These are all the problems that have been reported and continue to be reported. So many researchers want to investigate how much does bottom-up skills training, how much can this help our learners in becoming better listeners. So intervention is carried out through different kinds of perception activities, including integrating it with pronunciation, instruction, both the suprasegmentals and segmentals. So Caldwell, for example, puts forward great framework of how we should teach listening in the segmental and suprasegmental or intonation levels. Now, many of these studies have shown that when learners are trained in bottom-up skills, they definitely improve in their bottom-up perception. But if this is taken as a whole, some of the studies shows that it has minimal effect on overall listening comprehension. And this is reported by Hamada, Siegel and Siegel, Yeldam and Gruber, and also Yeldam. Bottom-up skills training is important, but what they're suggesting is that it is important to combine it with strategy training, which means, to make use of some of the top-down strategic processes. So Yeldam 2016, for example, carried out a very interesting study that explained this very clearly. Another aspect of teaching is process-oriented instruction. Now, there are different ways of explaining this, but I would use the description that this is an approach to develop strategic L2 listeners who use top-down and bottom-up skills and also manage their listening processes and overall development. And this is not yet widely adopted, according to Graham. Intervention, I would use the framework by Vandergrift and Cross, and distinguish between metacognitive instruction, which is more holistic, developing skills, awareness, introspection, and the other part is strategy instruction, which focuses more narrowly on just learning how to use strategy. And the effects of these can be determined in different ways. And one of the outcomes of process-oriented instruction is that it's not the hope is not that it improves listening processing, but it also improves metacognitive awareness, confidence, motivation, and all these have been reported among different age groups as well. Okay, last point about technology, teaching is technology-enabled instruction. We know that there is already so much that we can do with making use of technology. And because of this, we find that there's more time that is being spent on listening, promoting self-directed learning, self-regulation, improvement of metacognition. We see this being used in studies involving web-based activities, involving podcasts for extensive listening, and also using other kinds of mobile devices. What this is useful to us is that technology itself is a great enabler for learners to learn both in the classroom and outside the classroom. But at the same time, there's also one strand of technology-enabled instruction that is very interesting, which is about how much captions can assist listening comprehension. And I suppose the insights that coming out of it is that captions do help. Now, I remember when I first started as a teacher, I was told, if you use captions, it's like cheating because your students are not listening. But actually, if you think about it more deeply, teaching and learning requires support. It is a process that requires time. So what the researchers have found is that captions, whether it is in L1 or L2, can assist listening comprehension in ways such as learners' directed attention to what they hear. They also assess what they hear. They check what they hear using some of the captions. Now, I would say captions need to be used very carefully in teaching, but I think teachers will have to decide how to use them in different ways so that there are also opportunities for listening without captions. But the research is telling us that it helps learners. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. Coming back to the systems model, what I've tried to do is to highlight some of the factors, internal factors, as well as external factors that have been researched on, and also the teaching that has been examined that can help cognitive, social, and strategic processing. In other words, to help our learners develop listening over time, help them to develop listening by understanding themselves as listeners, and at the same time developing important skills such as bottom-up skills, and as well as using strategic processing strategies in order to help them become more effective as listeners. So let me end with this. What are some of the conclusions and teaching implications? There's definitely a better understanding now about the relationship between internal and external factors. We understand more about the relationship between working memory and other factors. But what we haven't seen is the establishing of causality, because many of these studies, the researchers set out to really study the strength of the relationships. And these are very important insights as we continue to build our theory, our understanding of the construct of L2 listening.
Maaf.
Some factors more attention than others. And I really would like to encourage, especially our young researchers here, or even researchers who have been in listening for a long time, to start looking at other areas in order to expand the field. We have lots of interesting work that's come out in the last 10 years. Let's continue to do more of that. In terms of teaching, we know that listening processes are largely hidden from the naked eye. So as teachers, we must find ways to help learners make these explicit in order to help them have control over these processes. If they can't see it, they don't think about it, they don't reflect on it, it's very hard to exercise the kind of agency to help them develop their listening. It takes time. And as I said in the earlier point, explicit teaching will help both in developing needed skills, developing some of the language or preparing them with the language that they may need, as well as developing them with ways in which they can become more metacognitively aware and strategic. Teaching about L2 listening, as we can see from some of the studies I've shown you, is that it must be done holistically. What the researchers have done, and they've done it correctly, is to isolate the different variables because you have to examine them separately. But as teachers, the way we look at the research is that we can now see that there are many rich insights that we can take. And one of which is that we need to address all these important areas because listening is a very complex activity. And finally, research practice gap. Graham 2017 did a discussion on, you know, this research practice. Although it was focused on the UK, I found that what Suzanne Graham has written is very applicable to all of us. There is still a large gap between what we know in research and what is translated into day-to-day practice. So that is all I would like to share with you today. And some of the references, more details can be found in these references I put here. And finally, I'd like to thank you. And if you find this presentation useful, I'm very happy for you to use it in your work. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to pass the time back to Dr. William and Nandya.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine, for a most insightful and very informative presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have about 5 minutes or so. If you have any questions, any burning questions that you want to ask, please let me know. You can just raise your hand and turn on your microphone directly. I haven't seen any questions in the chat box. Maybe I should begin with just one very small question, Christine. Today, students and we actually do a lot more viewing, you know, technically speaking, than just listening. Because the word listening reminds me of the old days when we have to listen to the audio tape recorder and things like that.
I remember.
Nowadays it's viewing. But what is important for us as a teacher and a researcher is whether and to what extent the processes that you mentioned early on are also applicable for viewing purposes. Your thoughts, please.
Yes, thanks, Willie. I think that's a great question, and it's definitely the way we listen nowadays. We don't just listen with our ears, we listen with our eyes, right? And what has the research been telling us? I think this is something that, again, is not surprising, because we found that students who, learners who have exposure to what is called audio-visual text tend to do better in the overall comprehension. And that is because they use some of the visual cues to help them maybe listen more strategically, or maybe to confirm a word that they've heard, right? So there are many cognitive processes that are taking place. But at the same time, there's some suggestion too from some studies that learners sometimes find it very distracting. And researchers like Wagner, who look at fixation on the monitor, also found that the weaker learners, those who didn't do so well, also spend a lot more time looking at the screen, almost 50%. And why is that? It's because they're trying to get cues from the screen to help them understand what they hear. So the processes themselves are very complex. But what I think we can safely say as educators is that audio video text definitely has a very important place. But at the same time, we should also have opportunities where students will only focus on the audio, so that they can learn to process the sounds, the rhythm, right? And also use strategies to make sense of some of the words when all other cues are absent.
Thank you so much. There's one question here from the audience in the chat box. Let me read the question to you. You mentioned the usefulness of captions. Now, what kind of captions, you know, would be most useful for our students? I think there's some distinction between captions and subtitles, whether it's L1, L2 subtitles, or whether caption is useful. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, thanks. So I took a shortcut, actually. You saw my slide. I put captions and I put down L1 and L2, right? So normally it's L2, we will call it subtitles. But I just used that as a shorthand. So sorry for some confusion. I would say that there is a place for each, but at the same time, there's also a place for viewing and listening without any captions. So as teachers, we need to plan how to use these captions. Now, for L1 captions, what are they good for? They are useful to help students as they listen to try and confirm their own hearing, their own perception. Now, some studies only make use of keyword captions instead of whole sentence captions. So that may also be one of the ways in which students can be helped. L2 subtitles, actually some studies have shown that they are helpful to some students, but actually some of the students found it very confusing, very distracting. So if you ask me, I would say use L1 caption in order to reinforce the hearing and the perception.
Thank you so much for that. Here's another question, very interesting, a kind of question that I also wanted to ask you. How do we integrate listening and speaking? Eventually, at the end of the day, we want our students to be able to produce the language. And so what is the place, what is the role of listening in students' speaking development? Christine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, a few months ago, I did a session in AsiaTEFL on in the pronunciation SIG, looking at the connection between pronunciation and listening. So I would say pronunciation is definitely part of speaking. And there are actually many opportunities to help students develop, particularly bottom-up listening skills in pronunciation classes. So I'll just leave that for now. The other thing is that, you know, I talked about the communicative language teaching methodology, which is such a great thing that we have, and we continue to use that. But I would say that we can make use of existing communicative language teaching where listening and speaking are integrated. But for teachers, what we need to do is to plan discrete activities and tasks to help students focus on the listening aspect. So one of the problems with speaking activities or oral communication activities is that we get students to do it, and after that, it's over and we move on to something else. We do not spend, sorry if I'm being too presumptuous here, but I think we do not spend enough time to help students think metacognitively about their listening and speaking. So long and short, the two can have a very, very good relationship in developing each skill together and mutually.
Yes. Thank you so much, Christine. There's one member of the audience here, Ibu Mutiara Bilkis. She's been raising her hand since yesterday.
I can see
Please go ahead, turn on your microphone.
Thank you, Mutiara.
Mutiara, turn on your microphone.
Thank you very much, really. I'm sorry for asking too many questions. Prof. Go, I'm really interested in your presentation because previously you mentioned that anxiety affected students' listening comprehension, right? Because I'm also researching on anxiety, but all this time I've only researched the productive skills. So I didn't know before that anxiety also affected the listening comprehension. So the focus of my studies is on strategies to alleviate the anxiety for the productive skills. But do you know what does research suggest on the strategies that teachers can do to alleviate students' anxiety on listening comprehension?
Thanks, Mutiara, for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say that it is rather than just focus on specific strategies that can alleviate anxiety, I would take a more metacognitive view about it, helping students understand what listening is about. Listening is a black box to many of our students. So we need to give them time and space to reflect on their own problems. What are things they do well in, what things they don't do well in, based on the tasks that they have done. And then help them to think through, and we provide some advice on how they may be able to progress to the next stage. And of course, there are strategies that they can learn. But I am also very careful not to say that we don't just teach strategies for the sake of strategies. They have to be contextualized. And many of the researchers in strategy use have shown that too, that students are able to do very well in one kind of task, but not so well in another. So in order to alleviate anxiety, I would say, help them to understand more about the listening process. Let them understand, talk about it so that they're not fearful about it. And of course, think about effective strategies. If they are anxious when they're talking to someone, what can they do? Right? And teach them communication strategies. What can they ask the other person in order to give themselves time to process, and also to get the other person to help them understand more.
Good, excellent.
Really?
Yes.
Actually,
Time is up, is it?
no, somebody on site raising hands since yesterday.
Okay. So how do we go about it? Please go ahead. Can you ask the person to?
I'm the one who
Oh, you
wanna
are.
ask.
Okay. Okay. So you are from the on-site
Thank you.
audience.
Finally, Pak
Yes.
Willy.
Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Jessica Mayoktarani from Universitas Muhammadiyah Semarang. Just want to clarify, probably I missed in your slide, Professor Christine. Thank you for your insightful presentation. I noticed in your slide for the listening approach, slide 16, if you can share screen, you put 3 arrows over there and the length is different. Is it mean that do you have a certain approach that needs to be stressed, or those 3 just equally shared as importance? As
Oh, the 3 approaches. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
those
you.
3 approaches with 3 arrows. Yeah, so that they actually refer to how long these approaches have been around. So for example, the longest one was text comprehension, right? And that started in the 50s and the 60s, where listening is really testing. Students listen to a passage and they answer a question. So I left the arrows there because I think there are still elements of such testing in our listening classes. Is that, sorry about the confusion, but the length refers to the duration these approaches have been around in language teaching.
Yes, very clear. One last question, perhaps from Ibu Nina Inayati. I think she's been raising her hand since yesterday also.
Yesterday too. Thank you, Pak Willy.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, Professor Go, thank you for the insightful presentation. I have a question related to Pak Willy's comments actually about the use of YouTube and other social media. I came across in literature about OILI, if you have heard about it. I'm sure you have, online informal learning of English, which basically means that if you YouTube, TikTok, or any social media every day, so, and mostly in English, so English language learning comes more naturally to them, based mostly online, in online context. Yeah. Now I wonder what the literature has suggested about this phenomenon when it comes to teaching listening, and simply how to make the best of their viewing time, extensive viewing time in ELT, especially in teaching listening.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Pramina. Yes, definitely right now we have a lot of these resources, YouTube, TikTok, as you have said, right? And they will be very useful for practice, for students to watch, because these are audio-visual texts. They can listen and they can also watch at the same time. So it would be very useful, and we can make use of them for the classrooms as well. There are also other kinds of technology that students can use, which also help them in their listening. So I would say that as we approach the teaching and learning of listening, we should try to be as holistic and comprehensive. And as teachers, we design the learning environment for our students. And we are the ones who would advise them on all the different things that can help them. So students can practice on their own. Extensive listening is very important, because the more input they absorb, right, in a more natural setting, the better it is for them to develop this kind of perceptions. But at the same time, I would also emphasize that we need explicit guidance and teaching in the classroom. Otherwise, students can practice without knowing how or why they are focusing on certain things and what things they need to focus on. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christine. There are a lot more questions from the audience, but time is not with us, unfortunately. So that leaves us to thank again Professor Christine Go for her wonderful, wonderful presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Go for her presentation. Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you. Thanks so much for all the chats, messages as well. I will read them when this is over. Thank you. And please feel free to get in touch if you need to. Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Willy Renanda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Willy and Professor Christine Go. Ladies and gentlemen, the following sessions is parallel sessions and poster sessions. Parallel sessions will be conducted in room 1 to 25, online and on-site. poster sessions will be conducted online